All right, looks like it's 3:30, so it's time for the next presentation, which is me, Peter Kral, and I'm here to present you with SSIS project deployment, the T-SQL way.
Not just any speaker.
No, well, I'm getting to that. My name's Peter Kral, and I'm a certified MC solution. I'm Microsoft Certified Solution Associate 2012, 2014, 2016. I've got the MCSE for the data platform as well as the data management and analytics. Also, at the last PASS Summit in 2016, I participated and won the Speaker Idol contest. So what that means is that I defeated 11 other contestants as the person who gave a successful 5-minute speech. And what that means is I am guaranteed a speaking slot at next year's PASS Summit. I have submitted this and the one I gave in this morning, so one of these two will definitely be delivered in November. So you may be getting a preview of greatness or a huge failure, depending upon how it goes. Just wanted to hype our local user groups. I, of course, am going to hype our San Diego user groups. We have a BI chapter as well as a SQL Server chapter, first Thursday and third Thursday of the month down at San Diego. This SQL Saturday, I believe, is hosted by the Malibu, the guys who run the Malibu user group. You've also got a Los Angeles user group, your Orange County user group, and the Los Angeles Korean user group here in the area. I also want to hype SQL Saturday coming up in San Diego in September. You can pretty much be sure I'll be there in one capacity or another, and I hope you can all make it down. And so let's talk a little bit about this talk. How many people here in this audience have constructed and deployed an SSIS package? Okay, that's good, like 50, 60% of you. How many of you have done a SSIS project deployment? Okay, so just a few less, like maybe 40%. Great. So if you've done an SSIS project deployment, it's likely that you've used the deployment wizard by using the deployment step from within Visual Studio. This talk is designed to give you the ability to deploy your SSIS packages and projects using T-SQL. So we're going to be focusing on the project deployment methodology, and we're going to look at all the T-SQL instrumentation that's available in the SSISDB once you've created the SSIS catalog on your server. Everything I'm going to show you should work in SSIS in SQL Server 2012. I'm using SQL Server 2016 on this desktop. SQL Server 2016 provides functionality for a single package deployment. I may demonstrate that at the end if we have time. But for the time being, this is stuff you can use whether you're using 2012 or 2016 SQL Server. So the intended audience are people who are familiar with this deployment method and want to know how to do it using T-SQL. So the agenda is we're going to first define the deployment scope. What do we actually need to accomplish in order to say we've done a deployment? Then I'm going to go through and give you lots of demonstrations step by step to step you through the process, so you're going to see how we go from beginning to end to do this deployment. And then finally, hopefully you'll have some time for a little review and discussion about best practices and that sort of thing. So first let's start with the scope. Now when you use the wizard, you're going to do a lot of activities that are under the hood. You don't necessarily pay that much attention to them as long as your project's getting deployed and you can actually run things. Let's first take a look at the wizard and then take a look at what the scope of what it does is under the hood. So I'm going to bring up Visual Studio 2015. And I have open here in Visual Studio 2013 an SSIS project solution. So you can see over here, it's called SSIS Project Example. You can see that we've got a couple of connection managers in there, one for the database source and one for the database target. You can see we've just got one SSIS package, and it's super simple. We'll take a look at it in a second. You can also see that project.params file. That contains one project parameter that I've created simply for demonstration purposes. It's just a string, nothing fancy. You can see it's got a description. Similarly, looking at the package, which is called source to target because it just copies some data from a source to a target table. Very simply, I've just got a SQL task in there. I've got a data flow task just to have the very basics in there, very common scenario. And this package also has a parameter. This is called the package parameter. It's an integer. And again, it has a description. It's not required and it's not sensitive like the project parameter. So essentially, this is the subject of our deployment. Now, you may all know that once you've got a project and its packages set up in the way that you want, you can go over here to the solution and the project itself, and you can choose that second option, which is build. If you do that, you are going to end up with the following. It will create an ISPAC file, or ISPAC, as some people call it, which I kind of like better. Essentially, this is your payload. This has your packages and all the project information that you need so that the server can actually host your project. Now, the nice thing about it is that this ISPAC is really nothing more nor less than a zip file. If I rename this to a zip file, I sure do want to change it, and just open it up, I can see the contents. So you can see the contents consist of the DTSX file, the actual package itself. We've got two connection managers, those CNM MGR extension files. We've got the project params file. And we've got a couple of other files which assist the SSISDB catalog in knowing what to do with the contents of this zip file. So there's no magic about it, really. It's just a matter of naming conventions and convention. So ISPAC, we'll rename that so it can find it. So the first step, of course, is to build. If you can't build, there's nothing to deploy because you got to fix something. But if you got to build, you've got an ISPAC, you're good to go. So now you can go ahead and choose your first option, deploy. So I'm going to go ahead and demonstrate that now. It's pretty simple. So if I hit deploy, it's going to launch this thing called the Integration Services Deployment Wizard. We love wizards. They make our life easy, right? So basically, all we need to do is it's going to say, okay, what server do you want to send it to? Local host. What path do you have? It defaults to this path. I actually may need to change that path because I think it's old. We'll go ahead and set up a new folder. I'm going to call it Wizard because we're using the wizard to do this deployment. And I'm not going to worry about that misspelling. So let's go ahead and do that. And if we deploy it, hopefully it works successfully. Sure enough, there we go. So this is a very common scenario for people who are using project deployment. You may have done it yourself. So one of the things we like to do is check things. Oh, it's not finished? Oh, we need to close it. All right. So one of the things we like to do is we like the UI. We like to be reassured that things happen the way we expected. If I go over here to my local server, I'm just going to go ahead and refresh the SSISDB, which is the catalog database. And if I look in there, sure enough, it's created a wizard folder. Now, everything that gets deployed in project deployment mode has to live in a folder. So it creates a wizard folder like it prompted me for. And underneath there, you can see here are projects and environments. If I drill down into my projects, sure enough, there's my SSIS project example. And if I drill down further, here's my package, source to target. So there you can see the most simple methodology for getting your project into production, or any other environment for that matter, where the SSISDB catalog has been set up for you. Great, wonderful. However, what just happened? You know, there was a lot of stuff going on in there we don't have any visibility to. The other thing is that the wizard can help you get that thing into SSISDB. But the whole beauty of the project deployment methodology is it exposes all the parameters in the package, in the project, and by default in, say, your connection managers. So, you know, all this does is put it out there, but it doesn't help you control those parameter settings from environment to environment or from execution to execution. And that's the real power of the project deployment methodology. So the wizard can get us somewhere, but it doesn't really get us to the place we need to be. We can do that using T-SQL, and I would posit that T-SQL is a better method for it because we can source control everything that we do. What's more, we make explicit every step that we're taking so we know what's going on in SSISDB. We can be more in control of our configuration. So that's the goal of this presentation, is to do what the wizard does and then some. So, it turns out that when we talk about the scope of an SSIS project deployment, what we did see that the wizard did was it created a folder and it deployed a project. That's what it did. But there's other things that you're going to want to do. You're going to want to grant folder permissions so other people can actually look at the things you've deployed, not just DBAs. You're going to want to review your parameters. You're going to want to create an environment and fill that environment with variables. You're going to want to tie those variables to the parameters that exist in your project and then assign them together so that when you run, you have an option of changing those parameter values quickly and easily using a bag of variables in your environment. So those are the things that we're going to do. I'll take you through the steps that the wizard did, and then we'll go all the way to the end to show you how to map those variables to parameters. Now, the rest of this is virtually all demo, so get ready for some scripts. All right, so the first thing I'm going to start with is folders. Nothing happens without a folder. You got to start there. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you the folder catalog view. One of the things you'll see if you start digging into SSISDB is there is a catalog schema, there's an internal schema, and then there's other schemas. Microsoft has set these up because they generally want you to go to the catalog schema to look at stuff. I'll show you in a little while that can be a pitfall, but generally speaking, if you can use something in the catalog schema, you should, because that's what Microsoft wants you to do. So, looking at the catalog view for folders, we can see it's very basic. The things we care about would be the folder ID, the name, and the description. Other than some audit fields, that's really all there is to it. Now, if I take a look at my current folders, I should see one, and sure enough, there it is, my wizard folder. I just created it. You can see it even has my misspelling in the description, so that's the one I just created. So what happens when I want to create a new one? Well, luckily, in the catalog schema, we have a create folder store procedure, which does exactly what you think it does. Now notice it has this output variable, so I have to create a variable to capture that value. And all that's going to do is going to output the ID that's automatically assigned to that folder when I create it, and it's going to assign that folder name. So I'll go ahead and do that now. And then I'm going to just verify that it occurred. So I should see two folders now, right? SSIS project folder and the wizard that I already had. And if I go down here to my SSISDB and refresh, there it is, right above the wizard folder, right where we expect it to see. Now the one thing you might notice is that there's no description. I have no idea why they did it this way, but they actually implemented the folder description as a separate stored procedure, set folder description. So the wizard under the hood must have been calling both of these functions. You have to call them separately, unfortunately. But you can see it's really easy. It's no big deal. Just go ahead and run it. And then if I run this again, I should see, sure enough, there's my description. Good to go. So let's go ahead and create another folder because it's fun. I'm going to call this the project folder of awesomeness. Oh, no, got to remember, got to declare that folder ID. It's an output variable. Okay. And now I have to give it a description because we need to know that it contains awesomeness if the name wasn't obvious enough. And then I'll just go ahead and select it and verify. Sure enough, there it is. And refresh here. Sure enough, there it is. Now, my boss comes to me and he says, you know what, this is not a very professional name for a folder. So what can I do? Well, I can rename the folder. I'll say, well, I'm all about seriousness at work, so we'll call this project folder seriousness. And if I take a look at it now, we can see, sure enough, now it's the seriousness folder. However, I didn't change the description. It still contains awesomeness, and now I'm like, you know, this thing was just a bad idea. Luckily, you can always delete a folder with the catalog delete folder command. You just give it the folder name, in this case, seriousness. I remove it. If I go over here and refresh, sure enough, it's gone. And I can also validate that by running this. So you can see how in T-SQL you have full control over creating and renaming and deleting your folders. One caveat, you can't delete a folder that isn't completely empty. If a folder has a project deployed to it, or if it has an environment, it will simply error. It says, sorry, I can't help you. But we'll see that there are T-SQL ways around that as well. Now, you've created a folder, but right now you're the only person that can see it, because you are basically the SSIS admin and or the SQL DBA. Let's say you want to share it so other people can look in your folder and see what you've deployed. So to do that, you need to get the folder ID, which is easy enough to get from the catalog folders view. Make sure you get the right name. And then we're going to use the catalog stored procedure grant permission. Now the grant permission is extensible in the sense that it will take several different object types. You can use grant permission to grant permissions for folders, for projects, for environments, and for packages, I believe. So there's 4 different types, object types you can do. And each one of them will use a generic object ID, but that object ID will be a different meaning depending upon what you're granting. It'll be a folder ID for a folder, a project ID for a project, etc. Now in this particular case, I'm granting the read permission, which is permission type 1, and the read objects permission on that folder, which means that whoever gets this can see the folder exists in the first place, can open it up, and can see the contents of that folder. And I'm granting that to principal ID 10, which corresponds to the SSIS data reader user in that database by default. So if I run this and it completes, that's great. Now, of course, every time you grant permissions, you want to make sure what you thought happened. So ideally, you would say, oh, I don't know, look in this folder, current user readable folders. As the current user, I should see all sorts of things because I'm like the admin. But I see nothing. So this is where I kind of wanted to reveal a little bit to you about the pitfalls of using some of the built-in functions and views that come from Microsoft. If I use the SP help text on this, I'm going to see that this view is dependent upon another view, effective object permissions. If I looked at effective object permissions, I'm going to see that it depends upon current user object permissions. If I take a look at that, I'm going to see that it depends upon internal object permissions. If I take a look at that, I see that that depends on folder permissions. So you just keep drilling down until eventually, oh, there's no text for that. That must be the real thing. And then sure enough, I look at this, I can see, okay, here are the 2 permissions I just granted, type 1 and type 101, just like I expected. So I bring this up just because for many of the things that you're going to create when you deploy using T-SQL, you're going to want to explicitly grant permissions to appropriate people within your organization, and you're also going to want to check, and if you check, make sure that you're working around some of the gaps, shall we say, in the delivered Microsoft functionality. So we're done with folders for the moment. The next thing we need to do, now that we have a folder, is now we can actually deploy a project. And this is one of the most significant things, but it's not very difficult to do. So if I go up here, I'm first going to just take a look at the catalog view for projects. And you can see how it's got quite a bit in here. Project ID, a folder ID, because everything needs to live in a folder, has a name and a description. There's a version. So it's very important to remember that projects have version control in SSISDB. You can roll back, which is good in some cases, but can be confusing in other cases. And then who deployed it, when it was deployed. This is important because it allows you to track what's the latest version of the projects that have been deployed. whether it's been validated or not. So the project table really is very, very key to everything that's going on. Now, if I take a look at my project table, I should see this project, which is in the wizard project. So sure enough, there it is. I'm going to go ahead and delete the wizard project at this point just to avoid confusion. And I can do that just by doing that. Well, let's see what happens. I'm trying to delete the wizard folder. Oh, won't let me, because it says only empty folders can be deleted. So you're safe from, deleting projects that are deployed that you don't expect. You can do it through the UI by just right-clicking and going to delete, and then going to the folder and delete. And this time, I should be fine. Okay. So now if I run this, I should have nothing, and I don't. So now let's talk about deploying an SSIS project using T-SQL. So first, we need a couple variables. Notice we need a var binary max. The reason for that is essentially we're going to take that isPack and we're going to take all the bits out of it and create a bit stream out of it. It's literally a snapshot of that project, and SSISDB knows what to do with that information if we can just get it to it. The other thing is an operation ID variable. Every deployment and many other actions that you take, like executing a package or something like that, is going to have a record in the operations tables. So it's going to generate an operation ID, so if there's an error or any other activity, you can use that ID to track down whatever happened. Now, this is kind of interesting. Open row set is a command that you can use to open any arbitrary file that SQL Server has access to. In this particular case, we're simply going to bulk input the contents of that isPack file that I showed you. And we're going to import it just as one single large binary object. Nothing fancy. We're just going to suck every bit out of it, and we're going to turn it into a stream. We're calling it project stream because that's the language that the SSISDB uses. Once we've done that, we're good to go. Here we can call the aptly named deploy project stored procedure. And you can see we're giving it a folder because everything lives in a folder. We've got a project name. We've got the project stream, which is the real payload that it cares about, and that operation ID, which will give us a handle on something if something went wrong. Then I'm just going to run this to verify that the project got deployed. And then I'm going to check the operations messages just to see. With operation messages, no news is good news. If you check and you don't see anything, chances are everything went fine. So it's sort of from the Unix model in that case. So this is a big chunk of code. I'm going to run it all at once. And if I do that, we should see, sure enough, my project just deployed. You can see the name I have here, the description, and various other pieces of information. All good to go. And you can see my operations result here is empty. No news is good news. That was a successful deployment. And I should be able to validate that by refreshing, drilling down, and sure enough, there it is, just like I expected. If I drill down further, sure enough, there's my package. A successful project deployment. At this moment, we are essentially where we were when we ran the wizard. You can see that we've got a folder, we've got a project with a package in it. Everything's happy. Now, I did want to show you this one stored procedure, which is catalog.getProject. You give it a folder name and a project name, and I just wanted you to see this. It's called project stream. It's the result. And this is essentially what we loaded into it via that open row set. So it's basically just got a full picture of everything that was in that isPack in binary form. And that's what gets updated or changed every time you redeploy. And that stream will be snapshotted and kept up to 5 versions automatically in SSISDB. So if you needed to roll back to a previous version, you could. It can get you into hot water, though, because while the projects are versioned, environments aren't. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, and so I'm going to go ahead and create a second folder just to illustrate some of the other stored procedures for the projects. This one's just called generically SSIS folder, and I'm just going to create that. Now, I'm going to wrap this in a transaction because I don't actually want to do this. I'm first going to just run a quick query that's going to show us where this project lives. It's going to bring back the folder name for a project and a bunch of other information. And then I'm going to run this stored procedure, move project. So you can see its parameters. I've got the source folder, the destination folder, and the project name of the project I want to move. And then I've just got another one here that's going to check to make sure that it did move like we expected and roll it back. If I do this, there you see the move folder works well. It moved it from the SSIS project folder to the SSIS folder, just like I expected. Similarly, you can delete a project. Again, I'm going to wrap this in a tran because I don't actually want to delete my project, but you can see how simple that is. You do have to give it the folder name, though, because you can have the same project name in different folders. So if I do this, it should show me the project catalog goes empty when I use the delete project stored procedure. Now, the final piece is you've got your project out there. Now you want to grant people permission to actually see it. So basically, we need to get a handle on the project ID. That's going to be our object ID that we're going to pass to our grant permission stored procedure. It's a type 2, which means it's a project. And we're going to grant it to the SSIS data reader. And I'm just going to grant read permissions to that permission type. Notice read permission 101 isn't available because a project doesn't have like the same structure as a folder. So the folder has more types of permissions than anything else that you can grant. Mainly it's going to be read and write and that sort of thing that you'll be granting. So I'll just go ahead and run that and just validate that I created the values that I wanted. And sure enough, these are the permissions that I just created. This one here at the bottom is the one I just created. These others are automatically created because I had that folder permission in place. Any project that was granted, any project that was created in that folder, automatically those grants cascade down as they were because that was one of the permissions that I gave it. So once you've granted, if you've granted your folder permissions correctly, you may not need to do this project by project, but there may be additional users who use one project, other users use another project, so you may need to grant them access separately. So at this point, we've accomplished what the wizard did using T-SQL. But, so what? I want to be able to deploy my projects from one environment to the other in a systematic way that allows me to assign those parameters variables that are appropriate to each environment. I have different servers in the dev environment, the QA environment, production. I want to be able to quickly and easily change those values in a systematic way, and I want to be able to source control it, and I want to be able to hand it off to my DBAs and know that they're executing what I wanted them to, predictably. So now we're going to launch into the interesting stuff, the stuff the wizard won't do for you. So the first thing we need to think about is parameters. Parameters are already instantiated by the very fact that we've deployed this project. You could see in the packages that I sent you, it had a package parameter, it had a project parameter, and you also get some stuff for free. If I run this stored procedure, get parameter values, you can see I gave it a folder name, project name, and a package name. It gives me all this information about the various variables that I have. So notice that up at the top, there is the project parameter. At the bottom, there is the package parameter. And then there's a bunch of other parameters whose names start with CM. That's short for connection manager. One of the beautiful things about the project deployment model is it parameterizes things that it knows you're commonly going to need to change. I mean, for me, the most important thing is the server name. I have to change that all the time between environments, and there it's automatically parameterized for me. I don't have to do anything else other than deploy the project to know that it's now exposed for me to set via a variable whenever I want. So to me, that's one of the real value adds of the project deployment model. So we have parameters. How are we going to set them to the values that we want? The way we do that is with environments. Now, environments, you can think of them as simply bags of variables. They're holders for variables that you want to assign to parameters whenever you run the package. So here we take a look at the view for environments. You can see it's pretty simple. Environments, like projects, need to live in folders. They have a name and a description. Really not much more than that, simply because they're nothing more than parking places for variables. So if I look at my current view, you can see I don't have any environments set up. Now I'm going to use the catalog create environment to create one, giving it the proper folder name, the proper environment name, SSI environment, and then just give it a description. So luckily, unlike folders, I can just go ahead and give it a description right off the bat. So I'll go ahead and run that, and then I'm just going to go ahead and automatically run, just to make sure that, sure enough, it got instantiated in my environments view. And I also just want to check, just also to have this in the demo so you have these queries available easily. You can see how I'm joining the folders and environments catalogs together just to make sure that it's in the right folder. And it is. And I'll also verify that by refreshing this view and drilling into environments, and sure enough, there's my SSIS environment. So you could have created this by hand and it would look pretty much the same. Notice there's nothing in here. There's no variables. There are some permissions by default. The DBO has default permissions, and also that is a consequence of the fact that we granted cascading rights in the folder. Since this environment is in that folder, some rights are automatically granted. All right. This is one I've wrapped in a trend just because I wanted to show that you can. Let me see if I actually have this. Refresh. Yeah. There's also, if you made a mistake, just like with a project, you can move. There is a command called move environment, and you just got to tell it the source folder, the destination folder, and it'll move it for you. Just like that, in this case from the SSIS project folder to the SSIS folder. Easy as you please. Then we can also rename an environment. If you happen to, think you got a more appropriate name, or naming conventions change over time, you can just go ahead and do a rename. Here you can see I gave it a fake name. Just I rolled it back, so no big deal. And finally, you can delete an environment. This one I'm also going to wrap in a trend because I don't actually want to delete it. But just to validate, it's that simple. The folder, environment name, boom, it's gone. No big deal. And finally, you are going to want to sometimes grant extra rights to the environment. So here we have the grant permission. This time it's an object type 3 for environment. And you can see we need the environment ID as the object ID. Everything else is the same as with the project that I just showed you. So if I run this, we should be able to verify that some new rights have been granted on this environment. And sure enough, this last one here with the big long SSID is the one that just got added. So, environments, great. Something the wizard won't do for you, but it's not very interesting until you start filling it with variables. These variables we create keeping in mind that we're using them for parameters. So generally speaking, I try to use naming conventions so it's very obvious which variable goes to which parameter. In some cases, just as obviously giving them the exact same name, just so it's, there's no doubt. Now, if I look at my catalog for environment_variables, as you can imagine, there's nothing there. There shouldn't be anything there since I haven't created anything except the environment itself. You can see the environment IDs have more details than the environment itself. You can have a variable ID, what environment holds that variable, a name and description, a data type, whether it's sensitive or not, meaning whether anybody can see it or whether not, and what value it's going to hold by default. And that's a SQL variant, so you can put almost anything in there that's a legal data type that SSIS will understand. And of course, I don't have any yet, but let's create some. Now, these commands start to get a little more noisy, so I'm going to give a little more attention to these just so you can see what's going on. So in the catalog schema, the create environment variable does exactly what you think it does. You got to give it a folder and an environment name because that uniquely identifies it. You can have an environment in 2 different folders with the same name. So we're going to give it a variable name. So in this case, I had the package parameter. I'm calling it variable for the package parameter. It's a data type int, which matches the parameter data type. Sensitive is 0. I'm just giving it an arbitrary value of 12, a dozen, why not? and then a description. So this environment variable will be associated with the package parameter. Couldn't be clearer. So if I run this and then take a look at my environment variables, I should see, sure enough, there it is. And that's great. We've set the stage for a parameter assignment from this variable. And I'm also just going to run this, also so you can see the join, but also just to validate, yes, indeed, it is in the proper folder, the one I expect it to be in. If I refresh this and drill down into my environments, refresh that too, I should be able to see there's the variable I just created. Excellent. Just the way I wanted it. Now, similarly, you can delete an environment variable very easily, giving it a folder name, an environment name, and a variable name. I'm going to roll this back, but just validate that if I run this, sure enough, it's going to wipe out that variable. So you have complete control via stored procedures. Now, this is also something that you will want to pay attention to, because from environment to environment, you will probably want to change variable values. You can do that using the set environment variable stored procedure. So you might remember that for this variable I just created, I started with an original variable value of 12. I'm now going to change it to 11 using the set environment value. And I'm going to roll it back, but I'm just going to run this just to show you that sure enough, that value was updated to 11 using that stored procedure. So I did also want to show you there are some stored procedures that will allow you to change a variable property. Unfortunately, it's an extremely weak stored procedure. It looks great. It says, okay, for this folder in the environment and the variable in that environment, let's figure out what property we want to change and give it this new property value, which would be awesome because we've got 4 or 5 properties that we could set. Unfortunately, this only has one value, and that is that it can update the description. So it's like one of those things that's a great idea, but it seems like they didn't really implement it fully. I'll just go ahead and show you that with a rollback, just to show you what would happen. So you can see this changed to that. That description changed to that. So it's not terribly useful. I want to make you aware of it though, because it could become great later if they ever actually truly wrote it out. Excuse me. So having created a variable specifically to set that package parameter, now I want to create a variable to control server names. So you can see here in that same environment, in that same folder, I'm creating a variable called server name variable. And it's a type string. It's not sensitive. This happens to be the name of my local laptop. And then I just gave it a description. So we'll go ahead and create that. And we'll just verify that it got created. And there you go. So there's my server name variable. And I've given it a good description so that we know that the reason for this variable's existence is I want to associate it with the server name parameter for my connection manager. So this is something the wizard won't do for you. You have to do this yourself, and you could do it through the UI, but you could see how if you've got like 20 variables to set up, it would take you in a half an hour. And it's not in source control. What if you fat-fingered it? It's not reproducible. So this is one of the reasons you really should be thinking about using T-SQL to create these things, because it will be repeatable. Put it in source control. It's all good. It gets you closer and closer to continuous integration, continuous deployment. So what have we done new? Folder, project in place. We know that. We've created an environment. We've filled it with a couple of variables. Now, this is where things matter. Now we get into the concept of a reference. So it's all very well and good, and you might think, oh, look at that. If I, look in here, and as a human being, it's obvious to me, since this environment is in with this project, that they must be related, and we're going to do stuff together. These entities don't know that. You have to tell them that they have a relationship. One of the reasons for that is that that environment could live in another folder, and you could still reference it if you wanted to. You could envision a scenario where you have one environment that rules them all. You have like 20 folders with 100 projects and just one big environment with a ton of variables. I don't suggest you do that, but you could do that and it would be no problem in terms of configuration. So that's why we have to define environment references so the project knows where am I allowed to look for variable values to assign to my parameters. So let's take a look at the environment references view, and you can see how each project has a reference type, which could be a project or a package. We need to know what environment folder it lives in, what environment name is of interest, and what project ID is going to be related to that environment. So there's a lot going on in there, but really the concept is pretty simple. We're building a bridge. We're saying, hey, Mr. Project, here's Mr. Environment. You two should know each other, like form a relationship. And we call that a reference. So you can see, using create environment reference, we can do that using T-SQL. So one thing I have to do is I need to create a reference ID, because you'll see that reference ID is going to be put out as an output variable. Now notice how I tell it what folder is happening in, what project I'm interested in, what environment by name I'm interested in. Now notice this, because this is pretty important. Environment folder name is a parameter, but it doesn't matter if your environment is in the same folder as the project. And that is indicated by the reference type. R for relative, A for absolute. If it's relative, all you need to do is say, okay, folder, project, environment, we're done. If it's in another folder, you're going to have to tell it what folder that environment is living in so that it can properly create the reference. And that would be of a type A. So in this particular case, it's relative. Everything's in the same folder. So I'm going to go ahead and create an environment reference. And there it is. So it's not much to look at, but this is critical. Like without this, you can't use environment variables to control parameter values. But you can see once you've done it how simple it is. And you can see how that's null right now because the environment is in the same folder and it's a relative reference type. So we've built our bridge between our project and our environment. We're almost there. Oh, one thing I did want to say is if you decide for whatever reason you want to break that bridge, there is this delete environment reference, and to do it you need to run a query like this. I want to demonstrate this, but I also want to leave this query here for you because it shows all the nice joins between all the tables. But if I run this, if I select it first, and then I run it, we're just going to be able to validate that we should have no references left. But I rolled it back, so we're good. So now let's go ahead and set an object parameter value. This is what it's all been leading up to. This is the payoff, right? We're going to say, for this specific parameter, in this environment I just told you existed, here's the variable I want you to use every time I execute. Or it's available to use every time I execute. You may choose not to use it for a given execution, but it becomes available. So you can see how, for the first one, it's object type 30. Object type 30 is package. Object type 20 is project. Why they didn't just let you use a string instead of a number, I don't know, but that's what works. So we've got the project folder name. We've got the project name. We've got, in this case, the package parameter, which you may remember from the package. And we've got the parameter value, which is the variable name in the environment that I want to use. Next, we give it the object name. In this case, it's a package name because it's a package parameter that we're setting. Notice that this would not be necessary if it was a project level. This is only required if it's a package. And finally, we have to say this is a relative value type. Now, if I run this, I guess I don't have a select statement. Well, I'll run it here. Oh, I'll run it in a second. So this one sets a package parameter value. This one will set a project parameter value. So you can see here, same folder and project. I'm using one of those automatically generated connection manager parameters, in this case the server name, and I'm assigning it to that server name variable that I had dropped in the environment earlier. I don't need an object name in this case because it's a project level, and it's going to be a relative value type. I'll go ahead and run this. And then we'll just validate that this exists. So notice that when I'm looking at my object parameters table right now, I'm looking for things where the field referenced variable name is not null. So anything where that field is populated, you know has been linked to a specific variable, and that's available for that parameter. And here you can see in the result set, you know, all the information you'd expect to see there, the object name, the parameter name, and the variable name right here. If I ran that without the where clause, we would just get a full list of all the parameters, and we'd have to pick out which ones have been referenced and which ones haven't. Now you can always delete one of these relationships. They don't call it delete though, they call it clear. You can clear the object parameter value. And if you do that, this is just an example where I'll do that for the server name for that connection manager that I wanted to set. If I run this and roll it back, you can see it's just going to remove that one reference. So the variable's still there, the parameter's still there, but there's no link between the variable and the parameter once we've taken it away. So if I go over here and look at my project folder, I'm going to go ahead and refresh. If I look in my environment, I'm going to see my two variables with the values I set them and the descriptions I gave them. Now the new thing is after I've done all of this, if I go up here to my projects and I right click on this and I go to configure, it's going to bring up this configure box, and lo and behold, if I look at this package parameter and the value, I can see it's populated with this underlined string. If I hit this ellipsis, it'll show me that it's using an environment variable, the variable for package parameter, as part of its configuration. And all of that was because of the T-SQL that we ran. Again, this is something you can do by hand, but you can imagine how onerous it would become if you had like 20 of these to set up. Now, similarly, if I go to, let's go all the way up here. If I go to connection managers, you can see how this connection manager doesn't have, it's just the default, the local host. But if I go to the project server name variable, you can see it's underlined. And if I click in here, you should see also that it is using the environment variable that I associated it with. That's the payoff, people. That's it. So we have gone way beyond what the wizard could ever do for you. We have scripted out things that would take you, you know, however much time and with however much error via the UI, and we've scripted it out. Check it into source control. Keep it up to date. You know what's going on. This is why I'm giving this presentation. I think T-SQL is a superior way to be managing these project deployments. And you can see from this demo, they've instrumented it to a great degree. Now we've got about 10 minutes left. So you're going to get to see how I actually implemented it at FTD, the company that I work at. I've sort of genericized the scripts to make it more useful for you as a download once I put it on the website. But hopefully we can get through this and you'll see a real life example of how this is used. So there's 3 scripts involved. The first one is basically what the wizard does. So this is just going to go ahead and it's going to get a bunch of, I have to give it a bunch of seed information at the beginning, and this would change from project to project. Where I work, we actually put 1 project per folder. We don't have so many projects that's as onerous for us, but there's no reason you have to do that. That's just how this happens to be written. But you can see how I give it a folder name, a folder description, a project name. I'm going here and I'm creating the project stream, which I then use later on. First I create the folder if it doesn't exist. I set a folder description. Then I deploy the project using that project stream that I loaded before. And then I go ahead and grant some permissions and I check the operations to see if everything went okay. Simple, right? And this is what the wizard does. Maybe without the granting of permissions, that's something that's extra. But it's essentially what the wizard does. So it's the second script that really is the value add. And it's more complicated, so hopefully I can step through this in a way that's meaningful. Essentially, we need to identify all those identifying pieces of information, right? Folder, project, environment, parameters, and environment variables. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create an environment variables table variable. Now, I don't have any packages that have more than like 15 of these. So if you might want to go with a table variable if you had, or a temp table, if you had a really long list of these to assign. But for me, a table variable works fine. But you can see how basically the key parts are the parameter name and the variable name, because that's what I want to marry together, right? Everything else is really just details around that. So essentially, oftentimes, this is kept simpler. Oftentimes what I'll do is have an if statement. If the server name is X, use these values. If the server name is Y, use those values for dev and QA and production. One way to do it. There's probably other ways. And then I have here just some sample for each data type that's legal of how that insert might look. So you're basically going to give it, the parameter name, the variable name, the type, other elements that need to be in there for when you create the environment variable, and whether it's a project or a package parameter type. So once you've done that, basically you can use that table and just iterate through one by one. First thing I'll do is check if the folder exists and if the environment exists. If it doesn't exist, I'll go ahead and create it. If not, no big deal, we've already got it. So all these things are designed to be rerunnable. It'll check for the existence of the environment. If it doesn't exist, it'll create it. If not, it just goes forward. And similarly, for each variable, it will check to see if it exists. If it doesn't, create it. And if it does exist, let's set the value to the one I just specified. Then it's going to go through and do that other part, which is set the object parameter value. So the second chunk of that iteration is after it's set the value for the variable, then it associates that variable with the appropriate parameter. I do have one helper script that I use. It's called, I call it this, but basically, if I run this, it's going to give me a table that's full of the interesting information about my variables. But the most important thing is this last column, which is nothing more nor less than just a big string. But what it allows me to do is I can just copy that, create a new window here, and if I paste it, you can see that basically it's each one of those lines of the insert that I need. So I can, for example, use the UI in the dev environment to mess around with stuff, get the variables the way I want. Then I can use this script to create the strings that I need to load that table. Similarly, you can go into production, run this, paste it into there, and keep it in source control. You could schedule that as a daily job. And in that way, you would always have a snapshot of what the values are in those environments each day that goes by. So you can see how, with the right expressions in the right jobs, you really can keep on top of source control. You really can keep on top of what your configuration is from day to day. Now, the final script I only include because, generally speaking, when I'm doing development, I'll create a job to run something in dev, and I'll use the UI to just script out the job as is, change the server name, put it in source control, deploy it to production. Usually it's fine. The problem is that for SSIS, the job step has something called the command. And that command is something that calls the SSIS service, essentially. And so it has a very specific syntax to it. But the one thing that's a sticking point is environments. The whole reason you create these jobs is so that the jobs know what environments to use when you're running it. But it doesn't let you reference the environment by name. You have to reference it by ID number, and you don't necessarily know what that ID number is going to be until it goes to production. So I have this rather elaborate job script that will first detect what the ID is based upon the name and folder that I expect, and then it will, put that command string into the proper place into the job creation script, and that makes it work in any environment. So it doesn't matter what order or where I'm deploying it, it will work. It will find the right environment and create the right reference. So All of these scripts I'm going to zip up and I'm going to put on the website along with the PowerPoint. PowerPoint, there's not much to it other than just the agenda. But I'm hoping that this will inspire you to think about using T-SQL. There's a ton of, as you can see, there was a ton of scripts in there. It should at least give you a starting point and maybe give you some idea of how to make the T-SQL deployment methodology work for you. So just to review, we used T-SQL to create a folder. We then granted some folder permissions, and because it's a folder, we could grant cascading permissions for all the projects and environments that were created within that folder. We deployed a project, and we added some extra permissions. We took a look at our parameters. We created an environment, granted some permissions to the environment. Created some variables within that environment. We created the relationship between parameters and variables, and then mapped them so that we knew which variables go with which parameters. And then I even showed you how a set of scripts you can use that will be rerunnable, that you can use in various environments that will even get you to the point where you've got the job ready to go for deployment. So, just to finish up, here's my info about who I am, where I work, and some of my social media contact points. There is one other piece of this that I hope to add if I get to do it at Summit, because they're going to give me 75 minutes instead of 60, and that would be how to use T-SQL to do single package deployment, which is that new feature that's available in SQL Server 2016. I have tried to get it to work. Microsoft provides painfully little, detail and no examples about how to do it. They just tell you what the stored procedure is. So I would say if you're coming to Summit and you're interested in that, come in the last 15 minutes of my presentation. Hopefully I will be able to show it to you, but I haven't figured it out yet. So, are there any questions?
I was just wondering if you'll be putting any scripts or anything out there anywhere that we can view?
So the question is, have I put the scripts out anywhere where we can view? I do actually have a GitHub site where I've put at least those last few scripts. I just put them there just at one point for some reason. But my intention is to zip up the PowerPoint and the demo scripts and put them, attach them to the session on the SQL Saturday site for this SQL Saturday in LA. Yeah. So you should be able to just go to town. Yeah. Any other questions? So the question is for the ISPAC file, which is the payload for the project. Do we need to have that on the server itself, or can it be somewhere else? Is that the kind of the question? Yeah. It really depends upon whether the service that your SQL Server is running under has access to that share. For me personally, I actually have the DBAs check out that file from source control and put it on a staging folder on the C drive of the actual server, because I don't like to rely on the network. It's like, there it is, it's local, it can't fail, But I do believe that you should be able to access that file from a file share if the SQL Server service account can reach it. Yeah. Yes? So the question is, if the package fails during... I would have to think so, in the sense that you would know at what point. Well, so the question was if, so the Wizard deployment methodology and the T-SQL deployment methodology could possibly fail. And the question is the T-SQL better for debugging? I would have to say yes, because you saw how the Wizard didn't actually give you any information at all. You may have gotten some error messages, but when you're doing it via T-SQL, it's much more likely you'll know at what point in the script it failed, so you'll be able to zero in more quickly on the trouble point. That's my thinking anyway. Yeah, I never used the Wizard, so I don't have much to say about it. Any other questions? Okay, listen, thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. Use T-SQL.